All right. Thanks. Thanks much to the organizers for having me. This is joint work with Gauti Eggertsson, who's a colleague of mine at Brown University, and Jacob Robbins, who's a grad student at Brown. And so I guess we've seen a lot of presentations today about thinking about demographic change and its impact on savings behavior and fitting certain patterns in the data. So this presentation is going to be a little bit different. I'm going to think about here how demographic change sort of can create a challenging economic environment, how these two things might be related. So it kind of relates sort of the long-term trends interacting with what we would typically think of as business cycle considerations. And since I'm the only one standing between you and the weekend, I'll try to make this quick and quick and painless. All right. So many of you are probably familiar with this picture. What I'm showing here is real interest rates for the U.S. Real interest rates on the short-term rate, the Fed funds rate, and on the 10-year rate from the late 1950s through today. And we're computing real interest rates by measuring, by subtracting off expected inflation, which we proxy for using a moving average of inflation. And what you can see here is we've drawn a gray line, which is the HP trend through the Fed funds rate, and we've also drawn quadratic trends for both the short rate and the benchmark rate. What you can see is that there's this sort of hump-shaped behavior. Real interest rates rose generally through the 1980s, and since the 1980s, real interest rates have been falling in the U.S. Real interest rates have also been falling for other advanced economies. This is not something that is unique to the U.S. And so, in the last sort of 5-6 years, the U.S. has been stuck at the zero lower bound. Recently, interest rates have risen slightly. Japan is still at the zero lower bound. The Eurozone is still at the zero lower bound. And in influential remarks delivered at the IMF, Larry Summers argued that we might be entering a period into which real interest rates have continued to fall. So the zero lower bound is not just going to be sort of a temporary problem facing us over the short term, but rather is going to become a chronic phenomenon that we're going to be dealing with the zero lower bound for the foreseeable future. And he termed that phenomenon secular stagnation. A low natural rate of interest, which means an interest rate that's consistent with full employment, subpar growth, inflation that sort of doesn't come back to where central banks want it to. So what we try to do in this paper is we try to make sense of that idea. Can we formalize this idea of secular stagnation? What are the sort of what's the underlying economic environment that's needed to generate these type of patterns? Because the standard models that we use to understand the zero lower bound, the basic New Keynesian model, actually doesn't generate a secular stagnation. It doesn't generate long-lasting zero lower bound episodes, and it generates dynamics for inflation and output that are frequently at odds with what we see in the data. The second question we want to ask is it possible for the natural rate of interest, the interest rate consistent with full employment, to be negative? And what would account for that fall in real interest rates over the last 20-25 years? Summers in his talk and in some of the informal dialogue around secular stagnation has suggested many different mechanisms. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to investigate what those mechanisms, what is the sort of quantitative contribution of each of those mechanisms. So to do the first, to attack the first question, sort of formalizing the idea of secular stagnation, we're going to lay out a sort of simple 3-period model along the lines of Samuelson, and use that to think about what are the forces that can reduce the real interest rate, but then think about how that interacts with nominal frictions in the zero lower bound to generate a secular stagnation.
Say the oracle talk. That's Mr.
Summers.
You want to say, how could we make the oracle make sense?
No. What we are saying is that Summers pointed out a series of facts in 2013. Low nominal interest rates, inflation that refuses to come back up to target, and output that never really returned back to trend. And he says, and he termed that secular stagnation. Those are trends that he's not those are patterns that he's not the only one to have observed, and those are patterns that are very difficult for the standard model that's been used to understand the zero lower bound, the new Keynesian model. That's very difficult for that model to capture. The new Keynesian model just cannot capture a 20-year or 30-year zero lower bound episode like what you've seen in Japan. It could not capture a 10-year zero lower bound episode, which is approximately what we've had in the US and the Eurozone. So,
invent that term, by the way.
What? No, he didn't invent the secular stagnation term in any case, right? He's talking about something from the 1930s from Alvin Hansen. I think he just crystallized in an effective way a set of patterns that we see in the data that are a puzzle for our existing class of models. And so so that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to say what are the components that you would need to generate qualitatively those types of patterns.
So is it about 2015 or the foreseeable future that you want to talk about?
It is about advanced economies since the Great Recession, and I think yes, we would like to think about this going forward as a
It's something to put. What would it take for secular stagnation to be here to stay?
Sure.
That's what.
Yes.
What you want.
Yes. And now when we get into sort of debates about whether the U.S. has an output gap, whether inflation is really all that much below target, those are obviously contentious debates. But we think that there's much more consensus about falling real interest rates, and there's whatever you think about sort of the implications for the rest of the real economy, there's still an interest in thinking about what's accounting for lower real interest rates. So to attack that question, we're going to use a quantitative life cycle model, a 56-period life cycle model. It's not going to be as sophisticated as what we've seen so far. It's not going to be at the state of the art, but we think this is still useful in thinking through what are the forces that might best account for the patterns, for the medium run patterns in the real interest rate. All right, so what do we find? We using our 3-period model, we are able to characterize a secular stagnation equilibrium in which a set of slow-moving forces, including demographic factors, can push the natural rate of interest, the interest rate consistent with full employment, into negative range. And when this happens, and the economy faces a zero lower bound, plus a monetary policy that is unwilling or unable to raise the inflation target, that means that the zero lower bound could be binding for an arbitrarily long period of time. And so you can get a situation that looks like Japan. You can get a situation that looks like the Eurozone, and to a lesser extent the US. This zero lower bound steady state, so there's a steady state where you're stuck at the zero lower bound forever and inflation is below target, is locally determinate. So that means that in the new Keynesian model, it's well understood that there is a steady state, a deflation steady state in the standard new Keynesian model. But in the standard new Keynesian model, that steady state is locally indeterminate. There are multiple paths that lead back to the steady state. Here, our steady state is well behaved. It's a locally determined steady state. On the quantitative side, we're going to use our quantitative model and argue that we can under a sort of standard parameterization of the model, we can fully account for the decline of interest rates from 1970 to 2015 by feeding in both the demographic factors and productivity factors. These two factors will turn out to play the largest role in accounting for the decline in the real interest rate in the US, we're also going to allow for capital demand factors to play an important role. So by capital demand factors, I mean things that depress, that depress demand for investment goods. And here I'm going to be thinking about a fall in the relative price of capital goods and an increase in markups. Those are two sources that have been suggested that might account for declines in investment demand. Our model is going to have fairly stark implications for monetary policy, and these implications for monetary policy are again quite different than the standard New Keynesian model. In the standard New Keynesian model, forward guidance is very powerful.
Maybe someone who doesn't understand it, but I can see an economy where population aging and other things and low productivity make a negative rate of return real.
Mm-hmm.
But isn't that consistent with any nominal interest rate that you want, that you can have?
Sure, but the question is, what does monetary policy do, right? Does monetary policy conduct, does it accommodate that low natural rate of interest by raising the inflation target? We're going to think about a situation where monetary policy is either unable or unwilling to do that. So here, there's forward guidance is entirely irrelevant. So forward guidance has been the preferred toolkit, the preferred tool for the ECB and the Federal Reserve in the Great Recession. But forward guidance is not useful in our setting. We, from our quantitative model, we get a significant fall in the long-run neutral interest rate to between -1.5% and -2%. This is based off of a particular calibration, but what we argue here is that the interest rates that we see today are not necessarily inconsistent with they may not be too low. They may be consistent with full employment. And that suggests that the zero lower bound is likely to remain a constraint on policy for the foreseeable future. All right, so I'm going to start out by illustrating this mechanism in a very simple 3-period overlapping generations model. So let's think about a household that lives for 3 periods, and it consumes in each period. It has standard log utility, and they face the following budget constraints. The young household is going to consume from whatever it can borrow, and it's going to borrow from its future income. It only receives income in the middle period. In the middle period, it's going to repay with interest whatever it borrowed when it's young, and it's going to save for retirement. So you have sort of standard life cycle motive here, and in the final period, the household is going to this is going to be negative borrowing. So the household is going to just consume whatever it's saved from the middle period. Additionally, we're going to assume that these young households are constrained by a collateral constraint. The total amount that they can borrow, inclusive of interest, has to be less than or equal to this constraint, which we just take as exogenous for now. So if this constraint is tight enough, then the young household is going to borrow all the way up to their constraint. The real interest rate is going to be, an Euler equation is going to determine the savings behavior for the middle generation household, and the old household is just going to consume whatever they have saved. So it's a very sort of standard life cycle motive for saving. How are demographics going to come into this? Demographics are going to come into this because cohorts are going to differ in size. There's going to be population growth here. So asset market equilibrium, the real interest rate is going to be determined by the supply and demand for loans. Young households, of which there are going to be NT, so NT is the size of the youngest cohort, are going to be the ones demanding loans. They're going to be supplied by middle generation households, which have a size of nt minus 1. So the growth rate of these cohorts is going to enter into asset market equilibrium. And if these young households borrow up to their constraint, you can show that loan demand is just going to depend on this constraint dt and the growth rate of the population. For loan supply is just simply going to be a fraction of disposable income. So households, middle generation households, they pay back their loans from last period, and then they're just going to save a constant fraction. So it's a very sort of simple asset market equilibrium. So from that, you can get a closed form expression for the real interest rate. And now the real interest rate depends on both demographic factors and on these constraints. And this, of course, sets apart the model from the standard representative agent model. In the standard representative agent model, the real interest rate in steady state is just going to be 1 over beta. If you have some productivity growth appears there as well. So now we have a way of thinking about how demographic factors and how some of these financial factors can enter into determining the real interest rate. So basically, our narrative for the Great Recession is one in which we think that real interest rates were coming down, both in the US and globally, due to demographic factors, and possibly other factors that we'll include in the richer model, but that we don't include here. But the demographic factors sort of capture some of the slow-moving factors that are pushing down the natural rate of interest. And then what happens in the Great Recession, you have a financial crisis that suddenly tightens these borrowing constraints. And that pushes the natural rate of interest negative.
That saving rates go up or saving goes up.
It would in a model with capital, right? So here there's no net saving, right?
You're going to try to map it to data. Is that one of the implications you'll have to see? Whether or not, I mean, do you need the savings to go up in the more fully calibrated model for this result to come up?
Yeah, so you do see in the Great Recession an increase in household savings, right? The household savings, well, there's household deleveraging, but overall investment is falling. So we would probably need some combination of a tightening of these constraints both for households and for firms in order to match the data. We're not going to try to actually capture the dynamic path of all these things in the data, but I think we would probably need both of those things. All right, so you have long-term factors that lower the lower the natural rate of interest. You have these short-term factors that can also account for lower interest rates. And one of the interesting things here is that if there's a permanent tightening of collateral constraints, there's a short-run decline in the real interest rate. There's also actually a long-run decline in the real interest rate. There's a lagged effect, and that lagged effect comes from the fact that once these households they take on less loans, they have more disposable income in the next period, and that tends to increase their savings and put further downward pressure on the real interest rate, which is sort of an interesting dynamic that you get from deleveraging in this model.
That's one thing that is really counterfactual, isn't it? That the share of wealth went from the older to younger people. That the difficulties in borrowing got worse. And I'm very sympathetic to many of the things you're saying, but that one,
that the young were able to borrow less?
The young were born to borrow less, even from before the Great Recession, when it was, that doesn't seem to be the case. That they're just saying because the young were able to borrow less, now the older are richer and they have more assets because they borrow less when young.
Yeah, you would think of this, though, as playing over a 20, 30-year period, right? I mean, that's true. I haven't tested it in this data, and I don't have a prior about whether it's, how it's an interesting sort of feature of the model, but yeah, I don't know if it's if it holds in the data. All right, so far what I've told you is just how the real interest rate is determined in this simple economy. Now we want to think about how does this interact with the zero lower bound. So in the background, now let's imagine that there are nominal bonds that are in zero net supply, but these nominal bonds will now determine the price level. And the central bank has control over the interest rate paid on these nominal bonds. But the interest rate is subject to the zero lower bound because of the presence of money. So money carries a zero rate of return, so the nominal interest rate can't be lowered below the zero lower bound. Well, what that's going to mean is that if the central bank has an inflation target, that inflation target is going to put a bound on the real interest rate. So here, let's say that central bank has an inflation target of 2%. In normal times, when the real interest rate is 2%, that's not a problem. But if the real interest rate, the full employment interest rate becomes negative, now that bound can be binding. So if you have a negative 2% interest rate that's consistent with full employment, you're up against the zero lower bound. You have to lower interest rates all the way to the zero lower bound to get that interest rate. And if it goes below that, then you cannot attain the full employment interest rate. So.
In a model without employment, just taking a model seriously, don't talk about employment. That's all you do.
I haven't told you about the production side of the economy yet, right? I'm going to tell you about the production side of the economy, and you're right that I will need an additional set of frictions in order to determine what happens to the production side of the economy. But the point here is that something has to give, right? All right. So on the income side, on the production side, I'm going to assume that output is produced only by labor, and there's a set of perfectly competitive firms. The output is produced with decreasing returns to scale, and I'm going to assume that labor supply is such that there's a constant inelastic supply of labor from households, and that only the middle generation households supply labor. Now, where is the possibility of unemployment going to arise? Unemployment is going to arise due to wage rigidity. So in order to make the sort of secular stagnation argument work, it is important that I have some form of nominal wage or price rigidity in the economy. We're going to model this through nominal wage rigidity.
Do you really need that, given that unemployment doesn't seem to be a big part of the secular stagnation going on, according to?
You need one of the two. You need either wage or price rigidity. I think that there are ways to think about wage rigidity in the short run leading to a decline in labor force participation in the long run, which would sort of be a hysteresis effect and would be consistent with sort of the behavior of employment coming out of the Great Recession.
I'm going to take this stagnation to mean low interest rates and low productivity growth. And that will increase productivity. So
I'm going to take stagnation as being low interest rates, a binding zero lower bound, and inflation below target. And then I'm going to ask separately what might be some of the factors that account for low real interest rates in the quantitative model. All right, so I'm going to assume here that firms here are perfectly competitive. They're going to hire labor such that the marginal product of labor equals the real wage. Middle generation households are going to supply some constant level of labor, and that's going to mean that there's a constant market clearing real wage. So absent any rigidities, then there's going to be a constant full employment level of output. What the key rigidity here is going to be some form of downward nominal wage rigidity. And what we're going to assume is that nominal wages are going to be bounded below by a wage norm. This wage norm, WT tilde, is going to depend in part on last period's nominal wage, and then is going to adjust with some probability gamma towards the, or with some weight gamma towards the flexible price real wage. So the flexible price, this is the flexible price nominal wage. That's going to have some influence on this wage norm. If gamma equals 1, you just have full downward nominal wage rigidity. So if real wages exceed their market clearing level, then the assumption is that employment is rationed, and you're going to have some level of unemployment. Households are going to want to supply L bar. Firms are only going to demand LT at prevailing wages, and there's going to be some households that are unable to work. So this assumption is fairly similar to ones that have been used in the literature, but I'm not arguing that this is a non-controversial assumption or a non-controversial way of specifying the wage rigidity. It's what we choose here. All right, so what properties then do you have of this economy? So there's going to be, if inflation is positive, if inflation is, if there's positive steady state inflation, then this wage norm is not going to bind. And what you have is that output is at its full employment level. We're just thinking about steady states here. However, if there's deflation, then the wage norm might bind. And what will happen is that output will fall below its full employment level. So where do I get this from? I get this from combining the wage equation with the marginal product of labor equals the real wage, and you can derive an expression here for output. Output falls below its full employment level, and it falls based on how it falls depending on the level of deflation. So you can basically get what you could think of as an aggregate supply line. This is just in steady state. You have, if inflation is high enough, output is at its full employment level because the wage norm doesn't bind. Once you enter into the deflation region, output will fall below its full employment level because the wage norm starts to bind. And the slope of this line is going to be determined by that parameter gamma, which indexes the degree of adjustment. So how do we close the economy? This is just one set of output inflation combinations. What's going to determine the other? What's going to determine output and inflation in steady state? Well, we have to go back to the expression for the real interest rate. So the left side of this equation is the expression for the real interest rate. The right side of the equation is that expression for the real interest rate that I derived earlier. The left side of the equation is just the Taylor rule. So above the zero lower bound, the Taylor rule is optimal, and so real interest rates will be increasing so long as inflation is above target. But at the zero lower bound, the central bank no longer abides by the Taylor rule. Essentially, it sets the nominal interest rate at 0, and inflation is determined. Inflation is whatever it has to be to satisfy this equation. And the point at which the zero lower bound binds is going to depend in part on the inflation target.
Should I think of this as saying any nominal interest rate that is any negative inflation, no matter what, is a disaster? This is what I'm hearing. Is that correct?
If inflation falls below the target and this wage norm is...
I don't know what target. It will suggest word for central bankers. But
Okay.
if inflation drops below 0, it's a disaster.
In this model, yes.
That's the only thing that really that happens.
Well, because you hit the zero lower bound and you enter. Yes.
That's the only thing. Everything else is doing fine. Thank you very much. It is doing on its own whatever its fundamental.
I mean, if you enter into deflation, the real interest rate is too high, and output falls below its full employment level. So that's a problem.
It falls because only, not that the interest rate.
It falls because of because there's these rigidities in the economy.
Yeah, but that's only, it's independent of what the real interest rate is. It's only because the inflation is negative that the economy is behaving suboptimally.
Yes, the economy is behaving suboptimally because monetary policy is conducted in such a way that the real interest rate cannot get to what it needs to be.
No, I'm trying to argue that. It's because monetary policy implies a negative inflation rate.
Monetary policy requires a positive inflation rate, but because monetary policy is conducted in such a way that that's not allowed to happen, the economy adjusts to this other equilibrium. And this other, what was that?
Are we saying different things?
I don't know, but I'm trying to be, I think so, and I'm trying to, all right. So in times of full employment, when the growth rate of population or the collateral constraint is high enough such that the full employment real interest rate is positive, everything's fine. We're at this full employment steady state. Now, what happens when that collateral constraint tightens, or what happens as population growth slows down? Well, what happens is that the central bank would like to lower the nominal interest rate in order to keep output at its full employment level. It's unable to do so. It hits the zero lower bound. So how does the economy adjust? The economy adjusts by hitting this deflation steady state. There's deflation that raises the real interest rate above its full employment level, and what's adjusting downwards? What's adjusting downwards as savings is adjusting downwards by as output falls.
Why is it unable to choose a positive inflation rate?
Because central banks have so far conducted monetary policy by setting an inflation target, and that inflation target is not high enough.
So all they have to do in this world is say, if they're doing something stupid, they set a positive inflation target. Then all problems disappear.
Yes, but as we've discovered with Japan, once you enter a liquidity trap, it can be hard to generate the expectations necessary to do that.
This model, I'm talking about this model, not the world, which is what I try to understand.
Yes.
In this model, I have to do is have an inflation rate that is higher.
Yes, subject to a proviso that I'll get into a second, but yes, yes, that's true. All right, so what is true about this steady state? Well, this steady state is a steady state where the zero lower bound is binding. And so the zero lower bound will continue to bind so long as the market clearing interest rate is too negative. Deflation is raising real wages above their market clearing level. But notice here that wages are still adjusting. It's not as if nominal wages are not moving. Nominal wages are falling, but the price level falls at the same rate, so the real wage doesn't fall. So what you have dynamics where the real wage rises during the shock and then just stays elevated at a level that's too high to clear the market. If you look at real wages in the U.S., there was this sort of jump up in real wages during the Great Recession. Output falls persistently below its full employment level. Taking it literally, there's a permanent rise in unemployment. What we can show is that this steady state will exist so long as there's any degree of price rigidity. So long as there's even an infinitesimal amount of price rigidity, this steady state exists. It's unique and it's locally determinate. So by locally determinate, again, I mean it's a well-behaved steady state. It doesn't have the feature of the new Keynesian zero lower bound steady state that is locally indeterminate. And that locally indeterminate steady state has been the subject of a different literature by Benhabib, Schmidt-Groh, and Uribe. So we think that that's an important difference of this class of models relative to the standard new Keynesian model. So what can monetary policy do? The Eggertsson-Krugman model emphasized an extended commitment to keep nominal interest rates low in the form of forward guidance. Forward guidance is entirely ineffective here. Why is forward guidance ineffective? It's ineffective for two reasons. The first reason is that households and firms expect rates to remain low indefinitely. So a commitment to keep interest rates low in the future is not going to change their expectations in any way. The other issue is slightly more subtle. The IS curve, the relationship between interest rates and output, is not as forward-looking as it is in the standard New Keynesian model. So expectations of future output don't actually, they enter with a discount, or they actually enter in the simplest version of this model not at all. So there's been a literature that thinks about the so-called forward guidance puzzle, the puzzle that why is it that these commitments to keep interest rates so low seem to not really do anything. And so those models that have tried to capture the forward guidance puzzle, they feature some form of discounting. And we get this discounting for free because of the overlapping generation structure.
So we're still talking about the steady state here?
Yes?
So we have a permanent deflation. I mean, why would agents change their expectations if they know that there is permanent deflation? So it's obvious that forward guidance is not going to work. No?
Well, in the standard New Keynesian model, you have deflation for some period of time, but you, yeah, here it's permanent, but you have deflation for some period of time even in the New Keynesian model, and forward guidance can be effective in that it makes the deflation less bad.
Precisely because it's only a transitory period of deflation. Whereas here it's like permanent deflation, so there's no reason why agents should change their expectations. So it's obvious that forward guidance cannot work. No?
Yeah, I don't think this is a deep point, but it's because it's a steady state, right? That you're at this steady state, and if you don't expect anything to change, then commitments about things that are happening off the equilibrium path are not going to matter. So now Victor had suggested that the obvious sort of solution for this is to raise the inflation targets. For a sufficiently high inflation target, there exists this full employment steady state, right? The central bank can attain this negative natural rate of interest. But two things are true about raising the inflation target. First of all, a change in the inflation target changes this kink point, right? And if you raise the inflation target only by a little bit, well, that's not going to work, right? This is what Paul Krugman has called the timidity trap, that if you're going to raise the inflation target, you have to make sure that you raise the inflation target by enough. So that's the first question. Are central banks willing to raise the inflation target by enough? Say that you raise the inflation target by enough. Notice that you don't eliminate the secular stagnation steady state. If you are here at this steady state, there are now multiple steady states. There is a full employment steady state, but there is still a secular stagnation steady state. And both of these steady states are locally determinate. So that means for small shocks, you're going to return back to this same steady state. You would need a very large shock to move you from one steady state to the other.
What does that mean? It means that there's multiple equilibria.
There's multiple steady states.
So it depends on the distribution of wealth from the beginning?
It depends on the set of shocks and where you are. There's going to be a basin of attraction for one steady state and a basin of attraction for the other.
Imagine you are in the steady state of the bad one.
Yes.
The bad policy.
Yes.
And that implies a certain distribution of wealth.
Okay.
Okay, across generations, isn't it?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
And then you change it, the equilibrium is unique.
If you
Could you change the nominal path, isn't it? Because the equilibrium is unique.
yes.
So then the implicit is not relevant.
No, what I'm saying is that depending on the size of the shock, you might end up here or you might end up back here, right?
You mean
So
the shock as the central bankers move? What do you mean shock?
well, it would have to be whatever is causing whatever is moving you around in the steady state. It could be any number of fundamental shocks or policy shocks.
That's the inflation target. That's not a shock, that's a policy.
Sure.
And a policy is saying if they raise inflation target by a number,
Yes.
the equilibrium that ensues is unique.
If you start here, you raise the inflation target, you're not going to move from here.
I don't understand what you mean, the start here. The distribution of bond holdings across generations. Am I wrong? That's the only state.
And if it's at that steady, if it's at its steady state
Whatever it is,
distribution,
it has the young guy, the middle-aged guys have a certain number of bonds, and the old guys have a certain number of, have the opposite
Sure.
number of, have another number of bonds.
yes,
Now, if choose a nominal inflation rate,
yes,
then there is a unique subsequent path.
yes.
What you're saying is that
If you're at that steady state distribution, you're going to stay there.
you just change the price so that you will not stay there, they change the nominal inflation rate target as a policy, so I don't know what you mean by you stay there.
The target is not attained, right?
Why not?
Because it is fully consistent for there to be this other target in the background, but for households not to believe that they will attain it. So households,
It's about ignorance.
yes.
So, is it that when central bank announces an inflation rate, that's not what they do. All they can do is announce a nominal interest rate, and that's consistent with different equilibrium path, or what is it?
The nature of the announcement is the following. We're raising the inflation target to 4%, right? It is fully possible for households to say, that's irrelevant. The nominal interest rate is going to remain at 0,
So
and
there's multiple equilibria.
what was that?
There is multiple equilibria then. You cannot have it both ways. If it's in a multiple equilibria, because sometimes they could believe one thing or not.
Okay, it's a multiple equilibria in the sense that this is consistent with many policies. That yes, you could announce different policies, and those policies all, yes, have no effect whatsoever.
So what if the central bank announces a new target which is negative?
A new inflation target, which is they would want to choose a positive inflation target, not a negative one, because a negative inflation target would shift this,
But then
would move you further away. Remember that you want to you want to lower real interest rates, which means you need higher
you
inflation.
want to replicate the natural rate of interest.
Sure.
So what makes you, I mean, the reason you're not able to do that is that because you have a positive inflation target, right? That's the reason you have inflation.
No, you have an inflation target that is 0 or too close to 0.
Yeah, so that's why you cannot replicate the
Yes. Yes.
natural rate of interest.
Yes.
So you're saying even if you lower the inflation target, you're still not able to do that?
I'm saying if you raise the inflation target, you're still not able to do that. Because raising the inflation target allows you to attain a lower real interest rate. But you have these multiple steady states. All right, so fiscal policy, by contrast, is not going to suffer from the same problem. A fiscal expansion, this is not all fiscal expansions, this is only certain fiscal expansions. Certain types of fiscal expansions will be effective in shifting this entire schedule. So fiscal policy can maintain a unique steady state and shift you all the way to full employment if the fiscal policy intervention is of the right form and it's large enough. So what's a type of fiscal policy that would be effective here? Now, let's assume that the government will levy a tax on the middle generation and the old that obeys this specific rule. So taxes on the old will be related to taxes on the middle generation in this specific way. If fiscal policy is conducted in such a way, then there's no loan supply effects from an increase in public debt, but a permanent increase in public debt will increase loan demand. And so that will have this effect of shifting out the aggregate demand schedule. So a permanent increase here in the public debt can be in effective policy. Now, because public debt and money are perfect substitutes at the zero lower bound, this is also true for a permanent expansion in the money supply. So there are actions that can be taken by the central bank that would be useful. And this is a sense in which public debt is circumventing a tightening of a credit friction, as Woodford pointed out in an AEA P&P piece. Now, it's worth distinguishing what happens from a permanent increase from a temporary increase. A temporary increase in public debt is not going to be effective. So say today that taxes are lowered for the middle generation by issuing debt, and in the next period taxes are raised to repay that public debt. This is fully Ricardian. So in this setup, then loan demand and loan supply effects would perfectly cancel out. The temporary increase in the public debt would be ineffective in raising real interest rates. And so if you look at a case like Japan, Japan has increased its public debt by quite a bit over long periods of time. But it's never announced any intention of not wanting to lower its public debt or raising the money supply in some permanent way. When Japan looked like it was recovering in the early 2000s, the first thing they did was to greatly counteract quantitative easing. So here, the households' beliefs about what fiscal policy will do are going to be quite important. And typically, fiscal policy is not conducted with a rule in mind or with some commitment to the future. All right, so that's the sort of simple three-period model of secular stagnation. I'm going to next turn to, there's a question about how realistic this setup is. Is it possible to get a negative natural rate of interest? And so what I'm going to do in the last 10 minutes or so is briefly run through a standard life cycle model. Since people here are very familiar with the elements, you've seen them all today, I'm going to go through this relatively quickly. But we're now going to have a realistic population structure. NJT is going to denote the population at time t of a cohort of age j. We're going to think about changes in mortality as one of the changes that might affect the real interest rate over time. So these PJT plus 1s are the probability of survival between period t and t plus 1 for a household of age j. These survival probabilities are changing over time. And then you get these standard equations for population dynamics. Households are going to maximize their lifetime utility by choice of consumption and savings. The STT plus J's here are just their expectations of whether they survive to the terminal period. In the terminal period, they're going to have a warm glow bequest motive captured by this function, and then they're going to maximize expected utility. Again, the STT plus J's are the probability of surviving to a particular period, so it's just the product of these one-period survival probabilities. Households are going to accumulate assets. These assets are going to have a price. This is the relative price of capital goods. We're going to allow this relative price of capital goods to change over time as a possible way, as a possible mechanism that affects the real interest rate. They're going to supply labor inelastically and receive and have some change over time in their effective labor supply due to human capital. They receive profits from firms, and then they're going to receive a return on their assets. The return on their assets is going to in part depend on, they're going to receive these annuity payments. So for every period before the terminal period, whoever dies is their assets are just going to be redirected to households. Households are also going to face these debt constraints, so they can't go too negative in their asset holdings. So that leads to a standard Euler equation where you have a Lagrange multiplier if the debt constraint is binding. You get an optimal bequest condition that will relate the terminal consumption to how many assets to the level of assets that you bequeath, and the risk-free rate is going to be related here to the rental rate of capital and any change in the relative price of capital goods. We're going to introduce monopolistically competitive firms. These monopolistically competitive firms are going to face a downward sloping demand schedule that depends on the elasticity of substitution. We allow this elasticity of substitution to change over time. And what this captures over time is it captures changes in market power. Do firms have a greater ability to, do they face less elastic demand over time? And this is going to be one of the capital demand factors that might account for lower real interest rates. There's been an extensive literature that has argued that that firms today have greater market power. Intermediate good firms are going to sell to these final good firms. They're going to hire both capital and labor. Technological progress is going to be labor augmenting. So when I think about a slowdown in productivity growth, it's going to be a slowdown in labor augmenting technological progress. The elasticity, I'm going to allow the elasticity of substitution between capital and labor to be less than unity. And that's going to be important for whether the price of capital goods has any effect on the real interest rate. All right, so you have labor market clearing, asset market clearing, and then the distribution of profits and bequests have to satisfy these two conditions. How am I going to calibrate this model? I'm going to set some parameters directly measured in the data. I'm going to take survival rates and productivity growth, for example, directly from the data. I'm going to take another set of parameters taken from the literature. Here, the intertemporal elasticity of substitution and the production elasticity of substitution are going to be fairly important. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask the question about, can I calibrate this model in such a way as to match key targets in 2015? Can I get a negative natural rate of interest? Can I match the investment and output ratio and the labor share in 2015? And can I match some data on bequests and consumer credit today? And then I'm going to do a set of experiments where I say, if I take mortality rates, if I take population growth, if I take the relative price of capital goods back to its 1970s levels, what happens to the real interest rate? So I'm going to study both the stationary equilibrium and a perfect foresight transition path. What are the...
Are you matching population share? I mean, demographics is very slow moving, so it's hard for me to imagine that it's going to cause the secular stagnation or have a big impact in 2015 or 8.
So it's going to be very much sort of what it accounts for about 3 percentage points in the decline in the real interest rate. And you're right, it's going to be fairly slow moving. But you're going to think of this, I think we think of this as interacting with the business cycle. So the natural rate of interest is falling, but there's these financial factors that push the economy into recession. So there's an interaction between.
Not a question. The question is, how can you look at the world through steady-state versions of this for closing and for periods that are closed, given how slow it takes demographics?
So for the demographic experiment, I'm going to start the baby boom in the 1940s, and then I'm going to run it through to today.
So you get reasonable age distributions in 2015?
Yes. Yes. All right. I have 5 minutes left. So set these parameters from the data. I don't think there's that these are too controversial. Choose an elasticity of intertemporal substitution slightly below 1. Our production elasticity of substitution is going to be on the low side, and that's going to be important for generating sort of a weak response of the capital output ratio to declines in the real interest rate. And the depreciation rate is going to be on the higher end, which we think of as capturing the fact that we're capturing productive capital here. We're not thinking about residential investment. What are the targets that we're going to try to reach? We're going to target a natural rate of interest of negative 1.5%.
The way to do this is I'm going to calibrate them up to 1970, so given the pattern, or 1960, so given the demographics, to get the wealth to income ratio and the right wealth across all. Then we're going to increase survival, and slowly as people get older, when the interest rates are going to go down below a threshold. That's the way I would see what you're doing. You're doing something like that.
We're doing the reverse. We're saying we're targeting a set of things in 2015, and we're seeing how well do we capture the behavior since 1970 of the real interest rate. Part of the exercise is to see, can we attain these targets with some reasonable numbers. Now, I think your experiment makes complete sense too, and it might make more sense to target in 1970 and then see how much of what you explain going forward. But I don't think it makes a big difference. So these are the targets that we hit. These are the parameters that we set in order to hit those targets. Since I'm running slow on time, I'm going to skip the secular stagnation experiment, and I'm going to ask, how do we decompose a fall in the real interest rate? So between 1970 and 2015, there's a 4 percentage point move in the real interest rate. It goes from 2.55% to negative 1.5%. The mortality rate accounts for about 2 percentage point decline in the real interest rate, and the decline in the fertility rate accounts for another 2 percentage points. So together these two factors account for everything in the decline in the real interest rate. They're offset in part by a rise in government debt. Productivity growth accounts for another 2 percentage point decline in real interest rates, and then you have these other factors. We feed in a increase in markups in order to fit the decline in the labor share. So the labor share here, so markups account for about another 0.5 percentage point decline in real interest rates, and investment goods account for slightly less. The loosening of debt limits pushes you in the different directions. Yes, these are two steady states, two stationary equilibrium.
It makes sense to us, given that's what the point that she made before, because the drop in fertility started happening in 1956, 57.
Sure.
And what you're saying is that
So I'm going to do a second experiment where I initialize the economy in 1945 and I just feed in the baby boom. Let me get to that in a second. So that'll capture these demographic factors. But we wanted to also just do this comparison of stationary equilibria. So let me get to that experiment. So in this experiment, we are going to initiate a baby boom. That baby boom starts to enter the labor force. So we're only modeling the population, the working age population. So it enters at 25. You get the first hump, the first effect from the baby boom, and then you get a second baby boom that comes around 2020. This is the millennials, of course, and then that continues to filter through the population distribution. And so what we're feeding in here is we're feeding in both the decline in mortality and the change in fertility. And what you see is you get some slow movement in the real interest rate. You get a pretty sizable decline over the 2000s that pushes the real interest rate near zero. And our model projections suggest that the effect of the baby boom would continue to push real interest rates down over the next 10 to 15 years. So in terms of explaining a lot of the medium-term variation, it doesn't do this, but it does seem to capture some of the slower movement in the real interest rate. Now, if we put all these factors together, what does the transition path look like? Well, the transition path doesn't quite match it doesn't give you the hump shape, but it does give you the overall decline in the real interest rate. Why do we not get the hump shape? Well, part of this is because there's a productivity slowdown in the mid-1970s, and that productivity slowdown has a very strong effect on the real interest rate. But there these are perfectly anticipated, right? People are born in 1970 and they know that there's going to be a productivity slowdown, which is not necessarily probably the right way to think about it.
In this graph, is TFP changing as well? Or?
It is. A measured TFP would be changing because the effective labor supply is changing.
So how much of that decline in the interest rate coming from demographics
Versus the labor force effects? I don't know. We could do that.
you sneak very fast through the fact that you're choosing a non-standard substitution between capital and labor.
Yes.
And that looks to me like it's a crucial thing.
I think it is crucial for the size of the drop. I don't think it affects. We do some robustness in the paper, and we ask if we have sort of just Cobb-Douglas or if we have something closer to Cobb-Douglas.
Look at capital factor share, because that's a good way of thinking the extent to which these low frequency movements are consistent.
Okay.
Okay, because you could get the sense of they're moving somewhat, and that's what can discipline that one, not Mr. Oversberg.
Sounds good. All right, so these are. I'll leave you with these last thoughts, and let us get to food. Yeah.